Right, it looks like it's about 10 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. First off, once again, welcome to the Introduction to the New Visual Style Builder for WinForms webinar. First off, my name is Robert Shoemate. I'm a developer support specialist here at Telerik, and I specialize in the RAD controls for WinForms and Telerik reporting. So if you've had any questions early on in your experience with Telerik and you've perhaps sent an email onto the sales team or somebody, that probably got forwarded to me at some point, and maybe I've provided you with some assistance. My email address, if you're interested in contacting me after this webinar, is shoemate@telerik.com, and my blog is blogs.telerik.com/Robert Shoemate, and there I actually plan on writing a few entries this week to complement this webinar and talk about a couple more of the features in Visual Style Builder. And also there I talk a lot about WinForms and Telerik reporting as well. And finally, my Twitter account, if you're interested in following me on there, I'll provide updates of new blog entries, webinars, etc. That is @ShoeRob. So a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about today. First off, we're going to start with an overview of Visual Style Builder, and following that, we'll learn how to use Visual Style Builder, and we'll be theming the RAD button. And then following that, we'll learn a little bit about handling theme files, such as saving and loading the files and using and following that, we'll actually learn how to use those files that we saved from Visual Style Builder in our RAD controls based applications. And then I'll follow that with some resources that you can use to learn a little bit more about Visual Style Builder and the RAD controls for WinForms. And then finally, we'll do a little Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the question window and go to webinar, and we'll get to those at the end of the webinar. So the first thing that is good to take a look at before you begin working with Visual Style Builder is what makes theming possible in the RAD controls for WinForms. And this is basically a thing called the Telerik Presentation Framework, and it's the framework upon which the RAD controls for WinForms are built. And this framework is what offers the WPF-like features that you see in the RAD controls for WinForms-based applications. And the controls that make up the RAD controls, since they're using the Telerik Presentation Framework, they're actually built up of a hierarchy of elements and primitives. And elements are basically responsible for the layout and the painting and display of a RAD control or particular components of a control. And primitives would be like the leaf branches of that hierarchy, and they're responsible for defining the graphics that you want to paint in those RAD controls. So Visual Style Builder. What is Visual Style Builder? Well, it's basically a application, a tool that we include with the RAD controls for WinForms that allows you to create custom skins and themes for the RAD controls using a easy-to-use interface. And it's nothing new. We've had it in the past, but for Q1 2010, we've actually added some new features, and we've pretty much revamped the entire tool, and we've made it a lot easier. And so for Q1 2010, Visual Style Builder actually features a completely new layout. You now have the ability to edit every single one of the RAD controls at once, whereas previously you could only edit a single control at a time. And one of the key new features is this thing called Theme Repositories, which I'll be going over extensively here in a bit. But that basically allows you to define a set of properties that you can reuse on all of the different RAD controls, and I'll go over that here in just a second. So let's jump right into Visual Style Builder and take a look at it. So I'm going to switch over to a virtual machine I have. And so here's the new Visual Style Builder. As you can see, the interface is quite different from previous versions. Over to the left, we now feature a control structure view. And as you can see, all of the RAD controls are available. And when I select the controls, it updates this central view called the preview, where I can see a preview of that particular control as I'm editing it. And if I expand these, I can actually access all of those different elements and primitives I was talking about that make up the RAD controls, and pretty much define things for each of them. So as I switch over to design view here in the center, as I select the different elements of the RAD calendar, you can see that they get highlighted in the design view, and that's basically telling me the scope of the control I'll be editing once I start editing its different style properties. And the design view also gives me the ability to resize my object so I can see perhaps what it looks like if I'm using a gradient fill and I want to see what it looks like if the button's bigger. And if I switch over to preview, I can see it there as well. So I'm going to go ahead and size that back down real quick. And here to the bottom, I can actually see the elements and primitives that make up a control. So over here, I can see the hierarchy for that control. And then this is kind of a more detailed view where I can see the actual individual primitives that make up a control. And when I select these primitives, I can actually define styles for their different states. And that's what this view is over here. It's called the element states view. And for a button has a mouse over state. So when I mouse over that button, it'll change colors. And when I click the button, it has a pressed state. And so it might change to a different style depending on what state that's in. And I can actually define different styles for these primitives and elements that I have access to in this view based on the particular state of the control. And the final new thing that we've added to the interface is this brand new view called the repository view. And that's what we're going to go over right now. So I'm going to switch back over to PowerPoint. So a theme repository, what is that? Well, it's basically a reusable container for property settings, and you can apply them to those different element states that I was referring to in the element states view. And as you can see here, here's that repository view, and I've populated it with a few different repositories. You can actually click and drag these into the different states, and I'll show you that in just a second. But since you can now create these reusable containers for property settings, you can actually benefit quite a bit from them. A couple of the benefits are that you can build themes a lot quicker. In the previous versions of Visual Style Builder, you actually had to customize individually all of the property settings for all of those different elements and primitives you saw in that view down to the bottom. And since you can create these reusable containers, this actually results in a smaller XML file once you output your theme for use in your application, because basically all of your controls will be referencing these repositories, whereas previously, since you had to set individual property settings on all of your controls, that means if you used the same property settings across all controls, it saved all of those individual property settings. But since you can reference these containers, it's now only going to save the container and reference the container in your XML file, and therefore this will decrease the overall XML file size. And what this means is you'll have a faster load time for themes because the deserialization of that XML file will be much, much faster. So let's jump right into Visual Style Builder once again, and let's create one of these repositories. So I'm going to be working with the button mostly today because it's one of the more simple controls to define a theme for. And let's set up a fill for this button. Let's change the color. Right now it's just using its default color, which is a pretty plain gray color. So to do that, I first need to make sure I have the rad button element selected here in the control structure. And then here in the elements view, I need to select the particular type of primitive that I want to create a theme repository for. And that's going to be the fill primitive, which I already have selected, because I want to create a new fill for this button. And now that I have both of those selected, simply come over here to the theme repository view and click create new repository item. And this is going to pop up a dialog that will allow me to define the properties of that repository so I can apply it to my control. So let's go ahead and give this a nice readable name. I'm going to call this button normal fill because this is going to be the default fill for our button. And as you can see up here at the top, there's actually a repository item key and a display name for this repository item. So since our themes are getting serialized out to XML files, we actually need to define unique item keys for all of our different repositories. And we can define the display name as pretty much whatever we want. So that's just something to watch out for when you're creating your repositories. So let's go ahead and create a gradient property for this. I'm going to use an office glass rect, and let's make this orange. So there's our nice gradient fill, and refresh this window over here to the right. Let me go ahead and So as you can see in the properties window over here to the right now, it has all of the different colors defined that make up this gradient, and it has the gradient style selected to that office glass rect gradient style. And also something to note is that there's this new little square that showed up next to all of the properties that changed. And this basically tells me what properties this repository is going to change on my rad control once I apply it to it. So when I apply this to it, it's going to change all of the background colors, and it's going to change the gradient style. But it's not going to apply any of these other changes, of these other properties, because there were no changes made to them. They're still reflecting the default properties of the control. And in doing it this way, it actually reduces the overall XML file size because we're only going to save the properties we actually changed. So I'll go ahead and click OK. And as you can see, our new theme repository showed up, and applying it is actually quite simple. I'm just going to click it and drag it over to the default state of our button, which is the rad button element. And as you can see, it turned our button orange, and pretty simple compared to what you had to work with in the past. So let's switch back over to PowerPoint once again. So when working with themes, it's good to know about the different types of elements and primitives that the Telerik presentation framework uses. So there are actually 5 different types of primitive objects in the Telerik presentation framework. And these are fill, border, arrow, text, and image. And that repository we just created was actually one of the fill primitive. It actually applies to the fill primitive. And there's also a visual element that is used in the hierarchy of a rad control, and this can contain text and sometimes images. And there's also a light visual element, which basically supports all of the functionality of all of the different primitives that you see listed. And this is only used in a few of the rad controls, but it's something to watch out for. So based on these different primitives and elements that the controls are built of, when you're working with theme repositories, you actually define the theme repositories to work with those different primitives and elements. And so there are 5 different repository types, and those actually reflect those different primitive types you saw listed pretty much exactly the same. They're just repositories instead of primitives because they're going to be defining the properties of those primitives. And so they'll set the properties of those primitives, but they'll also set properties for visual elements and or light visual elements where that applies, because the visual element once again can contain text and sometimes images, so it kind of works with 2 primitives at once. And the light visual element once again will support all of those different primitive types, so you might be able to apply any one of these different repository types to a light visual element in a rad control. So, and once again, to apply a theme repository, as you saw a second ago, I just selected the controls element that I wanted to edit, that gradient fill primitive, and then I just created that repository, and I simply drag and drop it to the item state that I want to apply it to. So a couple notes on theme repositories, things that you should remember when you're working with them, is that once again they're reusable containers. And since they're reusable, you can actually apply repositories to that button, for example, but you could take that same repository and apply it to the calendar control, or all of the different controls. And when you go back and you change a setting on that repository, it's actually going to reflect that change in every single one of those controls that it's been applied to. So it's a pretty convenient feature for, you could actually just build a basic color schema that you want to work with in your application, and then define that on all of your controls using a theme repository, and then if later on you decide to change it, all you have to do is change those repositories instead of going back to each individual control. Something else that's convenient to know is that pretty much all of the different rad controls contain a root rad element, and this is the basic root element of the control. And this is where it's good to apply a common style for the whole control, because it only contains a single item state. And something important to know is, as I was talking about earlier when I showed you how to create that theme repository, it actually placed those little squares next to each of the different properties that were changed. And those are the properties it's going to change when I transition between states. So that was the default state I created those for. But if I had created those for the press state, it would have applied those properties and then if I hadn't defined those properties for the default state and switched back, it wouldn't unapply them because styles are not reset between states. So when you're working with theme repositories, you need to be sure to define all of the properties needed for the expected appearance for the different states. And I'll show you an example of that once we get back in Visual Style Builder. So let's go back to Visual Style Builder once again, and we're going to fill out our theme for that red button. So here it is once again. So let's create a couple new repositories. Let's create a text repository for this control. And I'm actually going to use this top level element, the rad button element, or well, actually I'm going to use that root rad element that I was talking about. So if I select the rad button, it's actually going to show me the root rad element inside of our elements view. And as you can see, it only contains a single element state. And if I click create new repository item, it will pop up what this particular root rad element supports, which is text, and I can create a text repository that I want to use with it. So let's go ahead and do that. For the font, let me just type this in here. I'm going to use Sego UI, and then for the size of this font, let's go with 12. And then let's define the color. I'll come over here to the properties grid, and let's define the color. I'll go ahead and come in here. Let's pick Azure for the color and click OK. And then let's give this a good name as well. It's good to have good naming conventions so that you remember what these repositories are for. So I'm going to call this, let's call this Azure, since that's the color. And let's call this Sego, which is the font, UI. I guess Sego UI, which is the font, and then the size of the font. And that'll be the key for it. And let's also make that the name. And since we've defined basically everything we change in the properties, we will know exactly what this font is for and what it changes when we want to use it to define our theme. So I'll go ahead and click OK. And here's my font that showed up. To apply it to my root rad element, I just simply need to click it once again and drag it over that root rad element. And as you can see, the text changed. And so now that's going to be applied to all of the different states in our control once I switch back to this rad button element. So let's go ahead and create a couple more repositories for our different button states, the mouse over state and the press state. So I need to make sure that I have that button fill primitive selected here in our elements view once again. Click create new repository item. And I'm going to do an office glass rect again, and let's go with yellow. And once again, need to make sure that I use good naming conventions. And this is going to be for the mouse over state, of our control. So I'm going to call this button hover fill, since that's what this particular repository is going to define. Go ahead and set that for the display name as well, and click OK. And let's create another fill for the button pressed state. And so for this one, let's go ahead and call it button pressed fill. And I'll go ahead and cut and paste that to be the display name as well. And let's also make that an office glass rect, and this time we'll choose red and click OK. And so now that we have our different button states defined, all we need to do once again is simply click and drag them to those different states. So now when you see my mouse hover over our button in the preview, you can see that it's switching to that repository for the mouse over state, which is that yellow gradient. And when I click the button, it changes to red gradient. Well, something cool to note here too is you can actually add an animated transition between these. So right now it's kind of a hard transition where it just switches immediately over to this yellow color or immediately over to the red color. But we can actually define that we want to have a gradual animated transition between these states. And to do that, I can simply double click my different repository items to open the repository editor back up and click this animated state transition checkbox. So I'll go ahead and do that for each of my different repositories. And now that I've done that, back in the preview, you can see that it has a gradual transition between those states, and so my theme looks a lot nicer when I'm working with it. Excuse me. So let's go ahead and define a different type of repository for our button. Let's define the border of our button. So to do that, I'm going to switch the primitive that I'm working with. I'm going to switch to the button border, the border primitive. And as you can see over here in the repository window, all of those fill primitives, all of those fill repositories actually disappeared. That's because I cannot apply them to this particular element type, the border primitive. So it goes ahead and it filters out all of the items that I cannot use with this particular state. And so when I switch back to the button fill, you can see that all of those button fills repositories show back up. So I'm going to switch back over to border and let's create a few of those. So go ahead and click create new repository item. And as you can see, a completely new dialog popped up that will let me define a border. So let's go ahead and call this button normal border. Go ahead and cut and paste this into the display name for this as well. And for the forecolor of this, I can actually just click right here. And I'm going to define the forecolor as orange. So I'm going to switch over to the web tab and scroll down to the orange color. And select that and click OK. And then there's our normal border. It has a nice preview of what that border is going to look like. And then let's create a border for the mouse over. And so for this, let's call this button hover border. And I'll go ahead and cut and paste this into the display name as well. And for the forecolor, let's go with yellow. So I'll switch over to that web tab and we'll scroll down to yellow. Click OK. And OK once again. And there's our yellow border. And then finally we need one more border for this control, which is going to be the red border for the button press state. So I'll go ahead and call this button press border. And paste that into our display name for this control as well. And for the forecolor, we'll just select red. So I'm going to scroll down to red and click OK. And then there are our three different border states. And as you can see, the element states are updated based on the context of this element's view. So when I have fill primitive selected, I can see the different styles that are defined for the element states that have to do with our fill. And when I select button border, I can only see those actually all go away because they don't apply to this particular state, because the element states for button border will only support these border repositories. So I'm going to go ahead and click and drag these over to our button. And as you can see, the border changed in our button, and now it has a nice transition between all of our states, and it includes that border. Something to note is a couple things about repositories and working with them. If you want to edit them, you can double click them as I was doing, or you can click this little button right here, just the edit repository button. If you want to delete a repository, you just simply click this X. And then when you're working with repositories, say if you want to remove a state from a button, you can actually click this little drop down right here, and it will show you all of the different repositories that are available to define for that particular state. And you can uncheck and check that checkbox to remove it or add it back to that particular state. And if you want to remove all repository item associations, you can click this button, because as I was talking about earlier, there's actually an element called light visual element that is used in some of the rad controls, and you can actually select multiple repository items to use with that particular element. And you can do that here as well, but since this control only supports the border state, it actually doesn't make a whole lot of sense here unless you perhaps created a different type of border and define different properties on those two borders, and it will actually it'll kind of merge those properties together so you can use them at the same time. But anyways, to remove those, you can just click this remove all repository items association button. So let's switch back over to PowerPoint once again. So let's say you want to do a little fine tuning in your theme. Well, so what we've worked with so far, here's a list of property precedence rules, and this basically defines the precedence different properties have in getting applied to our control. And what we've worked with so far are actually the default properties level and the repository items level. And the default properties level basically defines that default state we saw of our control, where it's just that simple gray button. And the repository items level is when we click and drag that repository over that state, those repository item properties are actually going to override the properties defined by the default level. And it will show that little square indicator in our properties window to let us know that that's being overridden by a repository item. And finally, there's one additional level that I'm going to show you here in a second. And this additional level is actually where you can define those properties on that particular state individually. So this will actually override that repository items level with whatever your property setting is specific to a single control. And for this, there will actually be a square indicator inside of our properties window, and it'll have a little black outline. So let's switch back over to our virtual machine once again and set that up. So for this, you can actually expand these different elements here in our elements view. So I'm going to expand our button fill. And as you can see, depending on which state I have selected, I can actually see the properties that are getting set for that particular state. And so I have orange selected, and it's telling me that the properties for our button are being overridden for background color, and it tells me that by showing me this little square that right there. So let's say I want to change one of these colors. Let's change back color 3, and I want to change it on this particular button. So I'm going to click this, and let's change the color to red color and click OK. And as you can see, it's defined that new color on our button, and here in our properties window, it's actually outlined that particular setting with a black outline, telling us that we've overridden that property. So it's overriding what our repository is doing on this control. And so something else I want to show you based around this, I'm going to go ahead and right click this and select reset value, and that'll actually switch it back to our repository state. I want to show you how we can actually use these repositories across different controls. So let's switch over to our rad calendar. So here in our rad calendar, let's find a good element to work with. Let's go to the table element and the calendar cell element. And this calendar cell element is actually one of those light visual elements I was talking about. Here in the repository window, you can actually see that all of our different repositories are being shown when we have this selected because it's a light visual element. It has the ability for us to assign all of these different repository items. So let's go ahead and assign our normal fill to this. As you can see, all of the cells in our rad calendar changed to that orange color. And let's go ahead and define a border on this as well. I'll show you that you can actually use two of these repositories in conjunction here, and this is where it makes sense to do that. So now that I have this defined on our rad calendar, let's switch back over to our rad button element and change one of these properties once again. I'm going to select that back color 3 property once again, and let's change it to that red color once again. So as you can see, my button has changed color, but if I switch back over to our rad calendar, it still retains that state defined by our repository that's been applied to it. And show you another cool thing. Go ahead and remove this property from our button. And let's say I want to modify our orange repository. So I'm going to double click this, and let's change the gradient for this to green. Go ahead and click OK. And here on our button, as you can see, it's changed that default state to green, but since we're using that repository on our calendar, it's actually going to change it there as well. So that's one of the most useful parts about using repositories. So I'm going to go ahead and change that repository back to its orange color. And let's switch back over to PowerPoint once again. So the next thing we're going to take a look at is saving out theme files and loading theme files. So for saving themes, when you save them, there's actually going to be a new XML file that gets output that contains all of the repositories defined for your particular theme. And there will also be, since you can now edit all of the different controls at the same time in Visual Style Builder, there will be separate XML files for each of these controls. And it's important to note that only metadata specific to the changes is saved. So anything that's at that default precedence level I was talking about will not get saved because that's the default state of the control. But if I create repositories, it's going to save that information. And then if I go to that additional precedence level and define properties directly on my control, it's going to save that data as well. So since we're only saving metadata specific to changes, this is going to result in smaller XML files and better performance because those XML files will deserialize faster when we import them into our applications, and you'll gain a smaller memory footprint related to that as well. So for loading themes in Visual Style Builder, there are actually two different options. You can load individual files, or you can load an entire directory. And you'll want to load an entire directory because we can now output all of those different XML files for each of our controls. And if you try to load, I guess, two different repositories, say you have a theme already loaded, but you want to access some repository items you created in a different theme, you can actually do that through the use of repository merging. So if you have your theme opened already and you go to file load and load a different repository, it's actually going to pop up a dialog that allows you to resolve the different key conflicts that might arise between those two repository files, and then you can merge them together to be part of your the theme that you're working on. A couple notes to take into account. Only one theme can be loaded at a time. Even though you can merge repositories, if you have two different controls that are defined for different themes, say I have the one I'm working on currently, and I try to load a theme I made previously, it's not going to allow me to do that because there's no way of merging those two things. And another thing to take to note is when you're loading your themes, you need to be sure to load the repository XML file. If you don't, then your controls are not going to have any of the repositories defined on them. So you need to make sure to load that file when you load any of your theme files. And also, you need to be careful when changing repository keys. Since you can only load, since you have the option of only loading individual controls for editing, and you don't have to load your overall theme if you don't want to, if you change a repository key in one of your repositories, it's actually going to only get changed for the currently loaded theme files for the controls that you're working with. If you change that key, it's not going to update the files that are not loaded, and this can kind of break those files. So you need to be sure that if you're working with repositories and you're going to be changing keys on repositories, that you need to make sure you have your entire theme loaded. So let's go back over to our virtual machine once again, and let's save out our theme. So I'm going to go up here to File and click Save, and as you can see, it's popped up a nice little save dialog that'll allow me to define our theme name. I'm going to go ahead and call this Bright Theme because we're using a lot of bright colors in it, and we can also define the destination folder that we want to output it to. I'm going to go ahead and select that now. So I'll go to C, Source, and we'll put it in the My Themes folder. And then here in the center, I can actually select the repository items I want to save with this theme. And I have the option of clicking this button, and this will select all of the repositories that I've actually used. So this kind of prevents me from saving repositories that I'm not using in this theme in case I've defined a couple while I've been making some changes somewhere. And having this option and this ability will basically allow me to make sure that my theme files are as small as they can possibly get before I import them into my application. And finally, you can actually select the individual theme files that you want to save. So we made changes to the rad button and the rad calendar. My changes to the rad calendar were pretty insignificant, so I don't want to save that file, so I'm going to go ahead and unclick that checkbox. But all of the changes, all of the controls you've changed will be listed here, and you can select and deselect the different themes you want to save. So now that I've set up all of these different options, I'll go ahead and click OK. And that's going to output our theme file. And if we open up Explorer here and go to the My Themes folder, here is the theme I just saved out. It's Bright Theme. It's saved out that repository XML file I was talking about, and it's also saved out an XML file specific to the rad button. And as you can see here, I have another theme I've defined previously, and I'm going to actually try to load that in right now and show you what happens. And that other theme, as you can see, is called the My Button theme. It will prefix all of your different XML files with the name of that theme. So let's try to load it in the repositories for that. So I'll go to File, Load, and I'm going to select the My Button Theme repository file and click Open. Well, this repository file actually contains fill states with the same exact keys as the fill states I'm using in my current application, or in my current theme. And so this dialog pops up that gives me some different options for merging repositories. So the different options I have are to not add the conflicting items to my destination repository. I can override the items that I have in my repository, and then I can basically override by a first come, first get added order based on the order of these repositories and the list that they're coming from, and that's that last option there. And I also have the option of clicking into these items and setting different keys so that I can actually merge all of them together at once. I'm going to go with the override destination repository items because I've decided I don't like these bright colors and I want to add some darker colors to my theme. So I'll click OK. And as you can see, it's replaced all of those repositories that I have with those that were merged in from that file. And now when I work with my button, I can see that those repositories are being used. So I'm going to go ahead and unload the theme because I don't want to do that. And the final thing I want to show you is, let's just go load our theme back up. I'm going to click load, and I'll go ahead and click my repository for Bright Theme, and let's click the button theme and click open. And as you can see, it's opened both that repository and the button theme, and so now we can see that in Visual Style Builder. And so that's a little bit about saving and loading themes. So the final thing I want to go over with you is how we actually use these themes in an application. I'm going to show you how to import themes using the Rad Theme Manager, and then we'll set the theme programmatically and also show you how to set it through the property grid if you want to try that as well. So let's switch over to our virtual machine once again, and we're done with Visual Style Builder. Our theme is created, and I actually have an application set up that contains some buttons. And this is where we're going to load in our theme because our theme is for buttons. So from the toolbox, I'm going to scroll down to the Telerik controls section, and there's actually a control called the Rad Theme Manager, and this theme manager manages those XML files for me. So I'm going to drag that into our form. As you can see, it got added to the control box down here, and I'm going to click the Smart tag on it, and I can select Load Themes from File. And that's going to pop up a dialog that will allow me to select those XML files. So I'll go ahead and select the Bright theme and its repository and click OK. And now that is available for use in my application. So if I want to define that theme on a button, I can actually click a button, and then down here in its properties window, if I scroll down to the theme name property and click this drop down, you can actually see our theme name show up in there, the Bright theme name. And if I click that, we'll update that button immediately, and then we can see our theme has been defined on it. So I'll go ahead and run the application, and we can take a look at that in action. So it should be up here in a second. There it is, and there's our theme. As you can see, it has that nice animated transition that we defined, and when we click it, it has a nice animated transition there as well. Well, what if we wanted to, it's kind of a hassle to define your theme name on each individual control in your application. What if we want to just, say that we want to use our theme on the entire application in a real simple way and not have to mess with this properties view? Well, that's actually pretty easy as well. So I'm going to set this back to its default property. Let's jump into the code behind for this form. There's actually a service called the Theme Resolution Service, and I'll go ahead and type that in right now. And this is where you can define the theme that you want to use in your overall application. And it's a static class, so I can just immediately access methods on it and properties. And there's an application theme name property, and I'm just going to set that to the name of our theme. And it's as simple as that. So now when I run our application, it's actually going to find everything that it can apply themes to, and it's going to apply them to it. And as you can see, it's discovered all of our buttons, and it's applied that theme to all of the buttons in our application. So it's pretty easy to apply a theme to your entire application if you want. It's just one line of code. So let's switch back over to PowerPoint once again. And so now that we've learned about Visual Style Builder, how to load and save themes, create theme repositories, and use our themes in our application, there's some resources available for you to take a look at if you're interested in looking more into using themes in your applications. You can actually download the rad controls for WinForms. We have trials available if you don't currently have an account with us. The trial or the rad controls for WinForms are available at telerik.com/WinForms, and that's actually the current release of the controls. It contains the older version of Visual Style Builder, which is not the one we were talking about today. If you want to try out the latest release of the rad controls for WinForms, we actually have the beta version currently available, and that features this latest version of Visual Style Builder that we were talking about today. And you can access that at telerik.com/labs. And included with the rad controls for WinForms is a demo application where you can see all of the different controls in use. Comes with several different themes that you can use in your application, some default themes that we provide. There's also documentation that's pretty extensive, covers exactly what you can do with every single one of the controls and what types of code and things you need to do to be able to deal with different scenarios that you might encounter. And also included with the rad controls for WinForms are various tools, including Visual Style Builder. And also available, we have videos available on our website at tv.telerik.com. And this webinar will actually be posted there later today. And there's actually another video on there, which I've covered Visual Style Builder fairly extensively. And there's videos pretty much for anything related to any of the different products that Telerik makes. So I recommend you check that out if you're interested in learning about something. And for WinForms, there's also a learning guide that's available to download from the website. Basically kind of a PDF book that you can use to learn step by step about all of the different rad controls. And then finally, there are blogs available. And once again, I said my blog is available at blogs.telerik.com/RobertShoemate. I'll go ahead and switch to the last slide, and that's right there. And that's where I'll write about many things related to WinForms and Telerik reporting and various other things related to all of the products that Telerik makes. So if you're interested in contacting me once again, say you have any questions for me later on that you might encounter, my email address is once again shoemate@telerik.com, and so feel free to email me. And my Twitter account once again is @shoerob, and Telerik is available on Twitter as well at Telerik, and you can also access us on Facebook at facebook.com/Telerik. So that's pretty much all we have to talk about today. I hope you've enjoyed learning about the latest version of Visual Style Builder, and I hope you download the latest version of rad controls and give it a try. Thanks for watching.